It's April 2022, and I am here in Santa Fe, New Mexico with Dr. Cris Moore of the Santa Fe Institute. Or how would you like people to know you?
Herr Doctor Professor, of course. Or I think it's Herr Professor Doctor, actually.
You do have hair.
I do have
long
hair. Yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
So we've made some experiments and talked for a while about what's the best way to concretely convey useful information and thoughts about the game. And it seems to work very well to play through the game from beginning to end and just comment on what we see and what we think about it. And really the goal of this conversation is to talk about what Cris likes and thinks is interesting, because I can do what I like later, right, anytime.
Yeah, so we're going to play through the game and focus on my favorite puzzles and like what their structure is, what they're teaching the player, kind of those moments of aha and revelation that the game produces, and how each one teaches you how to use the mechanic, often in a new way. And then I guess we'll use those individual puzzles as jumping off places for talking about sometimes the game as a whole and the design philosophy behind the game. And yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay. So the first world is like, okay, here's how to run. Here's how to jump. And it's like, oh, I know how to do this. And then a couple puzzles in, you're like, okay, we have all these monsters. What we do is, they're cute monsters, but still you kill monsters, right? That's what you do.
That's what I heard, yeah.
And the wonderful thing about this puzzle is the way this becomes one of the themes which recurs later on in the game, like a variation on a theme, where as the mechanics change, we see puzzles that look like this, but have very different solutions. Okay, bonk, bonk, bonk. We bonked all the guys. Oh, damn it, how do I get over there? If only that guy were still there. From like a computer science point of view, a greedy strategy isn't always the right one. You might want to look ahead a little bit and not immediately do the thing which seems naively like making progress. So these trolls, these monsters, they're not just opponents. They're going to turn out to be really vital resources in how we solve the puzzles. And this is the first little hint of that. And it's only 1 out of the 6, but it's already kind of a deep lesson, which I really like, because when you first enter this world, it's like, oh, I know what to do. I can just go bonk, 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 and then I'm done, but not quite.
Yeah, not quite. Now, when I was first coming up with this puzzle, it was in the earliest prototype of the game, I think. And so first I was like, what can I do to make a puzzle out of monsters? And then, of course, what's interesting or difficult about needing to bounce off a monster? It's like, oh, let's sort of misdirect people into bonking the monster off the screen that they need, right? And so this is sort of one of the first places in the game where we apply misdirection.
When they see this, because of the whole trope, the genre of platformers, they think they immediately know what to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And so now the thing I didn't think about, or, I thought about it way before release, but not immediately upon designing the puzzle, is that this puzzle actually could be pretty hard if you don't sit back and have the right mindset. Because what happens is you come up here, you get rid of all the monsters. Now there's 2 monsters left, and you try to get across the gap, and now you realize you have a problem. And you look at the screen to try and solve the problem. What tools do I have at my disposal to solve this problem?
Right.
And of course, the thing that solves the problem is gone. There is no visual clue that it was there, and you might not even remember that there happened to be one right there. You might vaguely remember, oh, there's some other monsters on the screen. And so this puzzle is harder for some people than I had expected because of that element, right? And that's why it's interesting being a game designer sometimes.
The first little part here makes you realize, oh, not only do I not always want to kill monsters immediately, sometimes I want to save them, and I want to get them from one place to another because I need them in some other place to do something for me, to let me jump off them there or pick up a key or something. And so that's really interesting. Of course, we got this whole platform dynamic.
So this part on the left-hand side was a later addition, right? And it came from wanting the level to have a little more meat to it and not just have this 1 or 2 puzzles, right? I felt very good about adding this part here. I'm pretty sure it was relatively late in the design of World 2. I wanted a way, I was like looking for more ways to use monsters to do stuff, right? I liked the idea of having a puzzle piece at the beginning of the level with clearly there's nothing around to get it, right? All of the puzzles previously to this in World 2, you can sort of see what's near it that might be actionable, with the exception of the killed monster on the previous level, right? Here, you walk into the level and clearly there's nothing, right? And so now you start saying, well, what could I use, right? And a lot of the times people don't know and they just play through the level and maybe come back later. But if you're kind of intrepid in your approach to this and you're really looking, you're like, oh, there's a monster there. If you're not thinking about that monster with respect to that puzzle piece, then maybe it looks like more of an obstacle that you have to get by. It's like, I'm just trying to get from left to right on the level. I'm going to ride a platform, right? And oh, I have to dodge a monster. And oh, I got the timing good. So I got over the cannon before the cannon fired.
Right. And you think
now I'm
that
smart.
Was the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe you forget about the puzzle piece even, right? And so this is a thing that I've learned to do sometimes as a designer, although it also can be bad, which I'll get to in a second. But, this platform and this lever seem like
the next thing for you to do.
They have an obvious use.
Uh-huh.
The obvious use isn't really that interesting, but it's plausible, right? And especially if you're early in the game, you don't have super high...
I'm still learning to run and jump here.
Yeah, it's plausible, but really this is an important puzzle element because you need to use a platform to get the piece on the left. And if there weren't a plausible excuse for why you would use this, then it's obviously part of the solution to the puzzle, right? But here it's a little bit hidden in plain sight by the fact that, well, look, obviously it's a little bit of an action platformer thing to time it right and ride across to the rest of the level. And that's something that I like to do when I can do it. Now, the downside of that approach is that sometimes in the quest to make excuses for things to be there, you can add a little too much and a level can get a little heavy and contrived. Mm-hmm. And maybe that even happens sometimes in Braid. It's something that I got more of a sense for in The Witness and in the new game. Yeah, I felt good about myself as a designer when I made this puzzle. It's one of my happier memories from the game.
Then in the next part of this, it gets really profound about the timing. At first, rewind is just a way to not die, right?
Yeah.
It's just, oh, good, I don't have a limited number of lives. I get to try this again. But then you realize, oh my gosh, if I can do that, what else can I do? And in this level, there's this jump that it looks like, oh, geez, how am I ever going to get this? I have to time this perfectly. And then you realize, well, but with the help of rewind, I can do this fine control of my timing. I can adjust by a fraction of a second without having to just try to do that in my head. I can almost measure it with the help of rewind and make sure that I'm there at exactly the right time. And of course, this plays out a lot later on in the game. You're using time as a resource to control your motions.
Originally, it was pretty hard to hit this kind of timing because there was no visual signal, right? So the cannons in the game, if you look at the cannon that's there now, right, there's a barrel piece and then there's a wooden mount piece with a little image of the monster on it so that if somehow time is stopped, or you could have levels where cannons shoot everything they're going to shoot and the monsters are somewhere else and you could look at it and remember. It probably doesn't help that much, but we thought it was a good idea to put in there. But then there's also the fuse, which is the most important thing here, right? Because the fuse helps you judge the timing, because you can say something like, I'm going to jump when the fuse is at this point.
Right.
Oh, that was too early, right? So let me wait a little bit more.
So you have that visual cue.
Yeah. Now, the problem is, and it's not that big of a problem, right? But games are often not perfect, right? And here I always have to contend with the fact that I'm doing puzzles, but it's also a platformer. And, if you're going to try the jump again, are you standing in the same place, right? If there's a little bit of acceleration on the run, did you jump super early or later, right? How far toward the ledge did you go? And all of these things also affect the jump.
Although
right?
the collision mechanics with the monsters is pretty forgiving, I think. I mean, you have a window there.
Yeah, but I mean, just, even when I go back and play this level, it's not totally easy for me. Like it takes
Absolutely.
a few tries, right?
It takes a few tries.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of shift of perspective. I mean, of course, lots of gamers are very happy to take many, many tries on a boss level or whatever, or some complicated run. But the rewind sort of changes your perspective a little bit on that. Like now your multiple tries are, they're not failures. It feels more like this is how you play the game because you can go back in time, you can rewind, time can branch in various ways. And this is kind of the part of the game where we first start to get that.
Let's talk about these two pieces of level one at a time. This first one came later, and then the part with the falling and the timing was the original idea of the whole level. That was in the original prototype, I believe. But the reason the level's called Leap of Faith is that is a classic idea of platformer design that it's bad to do. Like specifically, if you're playing one of these traditional platformers where you die if you do the wrong thing, then you don't want to put the player in a situation where they have to jump down to somewhere where they can't see, and maybe if they jump in the wrong spot, they might die, because that's completely unfair, right?
Right.
You're asking them to do something that they can't do, and it just feels
and
bad,
use
right?
up a life on it, and whatever.
Yeah, it's once a game starts feeling unfair like that, you lose a certain kind of faith in it, and yeah. So that's something that Rewind changes, right? Like, not only does dying not matter in the same way, like you have infinite lives, but also you could sort of, if you really want to be twitchy about it, you could kind of use this recon and like not fall all the way down and just rewind before you hit the bottom or whatever,
Exactly.
right? And so the setup of World 2 is that we're trying to find ways that, without being able to change what would happen, right? How does Rewind affect what you can do while you're playing, right? And so, like I said, Rewind doesn't affect the laws of physics, but you sort of can get information from the future.
And an impatient player would see that jump you have to execute in the second part of this level and say, oh, forget it. I can't play this. There's no way I can play such a demanding game that's demanding so much of my timing. This is no fun. And then you're like, oh, actually, I'm much more in control than I thought I was. I think there's a lot of points in the game where you're like, if only I could do, oh, wait, I can. I mean, this is so awesome because now we're coupling like time and space. So now we're really starting to use the rewind to control the relative position of these clouds, which, and change them from something we can't jump over to something we can. And that's really interesting, and it's really fun to play with the fact that half the clouds rewind, the other half don't. And of course, this gets deeper farther on in the game.
Of course, that, again, we start out designing one of these worlds, and the question is, again, what can you do? And I was in the mindset of what's the most minimal thing that I can do given this feature, technical or gameplay feature, that some things don't rewind, right? In the very original prototype of the game, it wasn't quite like this. It wasn't a property of objects. It was just like, there was just the magic key, right? And the magic key wouldn't rewind, right?
Right.
And then
why not other things?
Yeah, well, I realized later, the way we do the magic key is by excluding it from the rewind loop. So like, let's just have that be a property that could or might not be attached to any particular thing, right? So I was thinking, what's the most minimal thing you can do, and came up with this, and I like it, right? As always, when trying to balance, platformer with puzzle, it's a little bit harder than I wish it was in some ways, in the following way. So I said before, sometimes people miss jumps and they don't realize yet that they can rewind because they're not used to a game that has rewind, right? By the time people get here, probably they have used rewind a bunch and they remember it more. And the problem here is that you very carefully set this thing up, right? And by now, people might be rewinding. And when they rewind, they mess up. And if they rewind to a point when they were over one of the non-rewindable clouds, they'll fall earlier. It's like, it becomes a little more frustrating even than it should be, right? So of course, the right thing to do is be patient and line them up again. But if you do that too soon, you'll fly back up into the air, right? So you want to stand on the ground for a little bit, right? Hold on, rewind the right amount, get them in phase, and then not miss the jump, right? And of course, you can do things that are messier than that. That's like a very deliberate way to solve it. You can do things that are messier, but they're more frustrating, right? So,
but I also like this element of it, because now that there are objects in the world that don't rewind, it means that it might be a little tricky to recover the state you wanted. It means that, rewind is not just an undo. It's going to change some aspects of the world and not change others, and it's going to be a little complicated. And you start to sense that rewind is going to be this very dynamic element in your strategy. I like this one because at first you're like, okay, so I know how to do this because I just saw the previous puzzle, but oh wait, that's just too far. And one thing I did this thing that I call wiggle time, where you like repeatedly tap the backspace button a little bit until things are in just the right place. And
I see.
But yeah.
And now that's, again, something easy to mess up, because if you rewind too far, now you're in the air again, right? So
that's true.
You have to be a little bit patient and like tap, but it works.
Yeah, I guess I didn't mind that.
Yeah.
So
when I design a puzzle like this, I'm thinking about how it's perceived, because that's part of what I'm trying to make in a game like this, is not just the puzzle, right? But the experience of seeing the puzzle and what do you think when you see the puzzle, right? And in this one, it's pretty clearly, just like the one you just did, longer distance and, sort of bigger gap. Like, I just like the thought process of like, oh, it looks like I do the same thing, but I can't really do the same thing. And the way that I think about the difference between these two, which may or may not be the way any player ever does, right? But the difference is this one on the left is solvable statically. Like, you can rewind.
There's one move.
Yeah. You rewind till the things are in the right spacing, and then you go, right? And then if you don't mess up when you go, you get the puzzle piece, right? On the right-hand side, that is not the case, right?
And you have to use rewind more dynamically.
Yeah, in the middle of progress across the gap, you must use rewind in some way, and that's the difference between them.
Yeah, so sort of building up the virtuosity of the player in how they use rewind as a tool. There's also, there's a design element here which shows up later on, which is this long shelf above all this, which makes one kind of curious, like, why is that there? Because almost everything in the game is there for a reason, and is this, what's going on?
Seems very extraneous.
And maybe this time around it is, but later it isn't, and that's kind of nice. So let's see. Is this The Ground Beneath Her Feet?
Named after a novel by Salman Rushdie.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Yeah. I just really enjoyed it when I read it. And sometimes, okay, here's, it's a very amateur thing to do. Like when you're making something, to put like, oh, my favorite band has a song, and let me put a poster from them in my game or whatever, right? But sometimes I do that a little bit. It's okay. I do. Yeah, it happens a few times in this game, and yeah.
I mean,
it's fine.
Like I teach a subject, computer science, that people think is just a totally recent invention, and it has these very deep historical and intellectual roots, and I like pointing those out to people, that it goes deeper than they think. So I think it's really good to connect things to some other cultural works, older cultural works. I think it reminds you that this is part of a larger intellectual whole. I know not everybody's into that, but
it's also, so the reason it feels like an amateur thing to me is because when you don't have that many of your own ideas, it feels like ideas, right? Like, oh, especially for like, because being, I don't know how much I subscribe to some of these social lines that get drawn, but being a member of Generation X and like pop culture references being a thing, it's just one of those. And I don't know, I feel weird about it, but it's fine.
The part that I really like about this is on the screen to the right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we do this amazing thing of briefly standing on a platform that isn't there because it was there before, and oh my gosh, what's going on, and what does rewind really mean? Because there's a lot of places later in the game where you have to think quite hard about what it means to go backwards and what you'll still be able to do there, and to what extent the past and the present will interact and in what ways.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. So, the reason this level is the way it is in terms of putting these two puzzles together is because there's like a juxtaposition between them in a way. Like I wanted to think of them as duals of each other in some way, and I'm not sure that they are. I think that may be too...
the two halves of this puzzle?
Well, in this one on the left, it's perhaps more obvious in some ways, right? As long as you remember that the monster was there and don't run around the level and forget that he was there, right? But then next time if you go off, play the rest of the game, you come back, you see him, and then you're like, oh, right? It's not that hard to come up with the idea, I need to keep the monster alive, right? And then you sort of, you push the platform out of where you need it and then into where you need it. But it's not that hard of a puzzle, right?
Yeah, because at first
you're standing on the physicality of the platform, and so is the monster. How's that?
Yeah, and at first you think, oh, if I move it over there, then how do I get it back over there? And it's not rewindable, and
yeah. But then I somehow, where do ideas come from? But I had the idea to do something like the opposite, right? Like, how do I make it so that you have to like not be standing on the platform, right? So, and then that's why these two are juxtaposed in the same place, because each puzzle is one platform, one lever. And then in one, it's like you're standing on it. And then the other one, you stand on it to set it up, but you remove it, right? And that's what lets you get there.
Yeah, and I think this puzzle is, the second half of this puzzle is one where I was stuck for a little bit. And I was like, wait, this is impossible. Either the platform is there and I can't get down through it, or it isn't there and I will fall down. Again, it's one of these nice moments where it's like you think something is impossible, and that paradox, like, in the grand paradoxes of quantum mechanics, there's this saying of, oh, we have a paradox, finally we can make some progress. Yeah. And so these moments where like, come on, this is impossible, but okay, I guess it must be possible somehow because I bought this game, and this is not the last level in the game, but then that forces you to learn something new about the mechanics. Oh, right. Yes. This first part is just using rewind in a clever way. It's, again, save the monster, but now save the monster using rewind because we have to jump on the monster.
Yeah. This is one of these interesting places where you run up into design constraints of the game a little bit because, I didn't have a dynamic camera in the game. Like, the camera doesn't zoom out or in or anything like that. And I wanted to keep it simple. And also, that would have been more programming to do. And the game was already a lot of work, right? But in order for this puzzle to be not randomly solvable, it has to be kind of long, this period. Because otherwise, in the process of running around and rewinding and stuff, if you just happen to rewind correctly, you might accidentally brute force the puzzle. And in fact, with smaller versions of this, I did do that sometimes.
So it needs to be like at least 2 cannonball wavelengths long.
Yeah, something like that. And the thing is, it's almost wider than the screen, the entire distance that
you need to be over there by the time this happens. So yeah, it's
actually kind of challenging for that reason. And it's a little bit ergonomically unfriendly while you're figuring it out. But then eventually, there's a pretty straightforward solution. Like what I just did there was, I'll save the monster, but wait, he's over there. What did I need him for again? I was just trying to save him. And then by the time I get over there, I'm like, oh, maybe he'll bounce off a wall. No, he jumps off the platform into the spikes, right? And so you just hang out here for a while, right? And then you go do the thing. You go left where you can see the monster. And so I turned this thing that was awkward, the length of it, into an asset in the sense that
you realize you can do this as you move.
Well, it becomes a little bit tactical of like, I can't see the monster where I need to be. So let me go to where I can see the monster, right? It becomes just a little bit more deliberate.
I think, honestly, when I played this, I think I was willing to try a couple times until I got the timing of what was happening off camera. And, but yeah, that's probably because I just stood there.
So you cheated at the game is what you're saying.
What? I did not cheat. No. I learned.
Yes.
Now let's deal with there's the herd of bunnies. I find the bunnies very frightening, by the way.
Is it the visuals? Are they too cute, or is it the sound?
I mean, well, many cute things are intrinsically alarming, but I just, they're relentless. They're relentless. The yowling is terrible. I find them disturbing on many levels. Right. So this is the point where we alter the phase between those two cannons to cause a collision which wasn't happening in the initial state of the world, and that divides the frequency in two. And it's nice because the first thing you do is you just run through all this and you're like, whew, I survived. And then you get over to these platforms on the right. And again, you have the platform think. You think, oh, maybe if I run fast enough and get the timing just right, maybe I can get in between those. And maybe you try a couple of times. And if the frequency were just a little bit slower, maybe there would be a solution that involved totally twitchy, perfect timing. But instead you're like, wait, it's not that kind of game.
Yeah, and if the cannon fires too slowly, right, you don't really need to solve the puzzle. Even if the timing were tweaky, you could just get up this ladder and through this hallway, right? You need that to be clearly not solvable in the default state here, right? And so, of course, the solution is to do this thing that some players have happened by accident, which is fine, right? Because then you still need to figure out what to do with it and or not to spoil it with rewind. Although a small percentage of players just luckily get this and all the bunnies are dead, so they don't really rewind. And then there's no puzzle at the end for those people. But that happens relatively rarely, right?
Sure.
Okay, so the other end of the tuning I just mentioned is this wide interval has to be wide enough that even if you're not good at the Twitch platform skills, you can pretty easily get up the ladder and over, right? Because otherwise, well, that would be very frustrating because now I got hit by the thing and I'm dead. I have to rewind and I've messed up the synchronization and I have to go back there and do it. And the good part of the puzzle is seeing this happen, seeing the things hit, right? And then you're like, oh. And it could be that people just don't have the idea to try this and it doesn't happen serendipitously here. But there's a few other occasions in the game where it could happen. And so over the course of a playthrough, people probably see it at some point, right? Now, there's another piece of delicate tuning here that you may not be that obvious. It'll be obvious when I mention it, right? Which is, okay, when do cannonballs hit, right? What's the radius of the ball? Because it's got fire particles around it. You could imagine, and we also could just choose to make it bigger or smaller, right?
If it was too big, it would happen by chance. If it was too small, it would be maddeningly difficult.
Yes. In terms of setting up this interaction, it shouldn't be that hard to do, right? You should just think about it and then maybe try a little bit and like, oh, I miss, I'll rewind a little bit more.
Right. Once you get the idea, you want it to be relatively easy to execute.
Yeah. But the easier that is to execute, the more often this happens by accident, right? And also, depending on how purist you're being, and I honestly don't remember the answer to this question, do the cannonballs have the same radius for each other as they do relative to the player, right? Because if you made it easier to intersect here to make this puzzle easier, you make the rest of the game harder because jumping over a cannonball is harder, right? And so I suspect cannonball to cannonball radius is different from cannonball to player and cannonball to monster radius.
Well, it's reasonable for different types of particle collisions to different cross sections.
Sure.
Yes.
Justify it however you like. I justify it by, man, it's hard to make a good game, and we do whatever we can.
So here's our first layer. And so I have to admit, in standard video games, I hate the boss levels. I would much rather mow down large mobs of small to medium-sized baddies. I've just never really enjoyed the whole thing of having to carefully memorize, okay, he's charging up his lightning bolt. I have to dodge this way, and then I have to switch weapons because I can hit him in the left mandible, which is vulnerable for 3 seconds. And it's not really what I enjoy. So the first time I played the game, I got here, I was like, oh, Christ, a boss level. Ugh. But this is almost a parody of boss levels, right? First of all, you can rewind, and so you can undie. That's nice. So, if he hits you, whatever. But of course, there's this other nice thing going on, which gets back to what I said before about the magic immune key is the one that I can't get back. He looks magical and powerful and scary. He's sparkly. He has the green and gold glow, but I'm not stuck in here with him. He is stuck in here with me, precisely because he's immune to rewind. I can go back and bonk him again and again and again, and he does not get healed. In fact, it's fun to even, if you time it right, drop the chandelier on him multiple times in the same fall and just go up, down, up, down, up, down, and get a couple of hits off him. So, okay, he's designed to be scary. He makes noise. He jumps around. The world shakes at his footfall. But actually, once you know what's going on, you're in total control. His sparkliness turns out to make him less powerful than you are. I had to try this many, many times, actually, before I got the point. It's like all these things are killing me and trying to kill me, and so I rewind a little bit, so I'm alive again, and I get over there, and darn it, the platform is blocked, and what am I going to do? And you realize you have to get up there, evading the yowling rabbits and trolls without once using rewind. And again, I like this because at first rewind seems like this infinite superpower. You can always undie anytime you want. You can always undo anything. It's like, well, no, not quite. Sometimes rewinding has costs. Sometimes it doesn't return the world to the state you intended. And I really like that.
I'm glad you think so. Some people get really mad at this, not like mad, but I have a friend who's also a game designer who was like, I don't like this level because it's the first time rewind can actually cause you to fail the game, whereas before it was a way of not failing the game, right?
Well, exactly.
And I was like, well, but that's the point. That's what we're doing is we're touring
That's a feature,
the
not a bug.
Yeah, I'm glad you agree with me. Now, do you want to, okay, so when I first conceived this level, it was just like you're describing. Like there's a gauntlet of threats, and you've got to run that gauntlet in a platformer way, and if you mess up, then like you could maybe get a tiny mess up and still make it, but other than that, you probably have to retry.
Okay.
You could also do the following thing. You just hang out by the entrance. There's more monsters over there, but you don't really need to care about that right now. So you just hang out by the entrance, and then once this platform is over the other one,
right,
then all you have to do is not rewind till they overlap in the wrong way, right?
Right.
So now I can rewind.
Now you have some wiggle
so
room.
like, it's a little bit hard because
the platform has to be not so far to the left that the monsters are falling in, and yeah. So then there's this underground puzzle. Mm-hmm. So here we have rewinding keys and non-rewinding keys and rewinding locks and non-rewinding locks. And the first puzzle is, okay, I get it. I have a rewindable key and a non-rewindable lock, and that means I get to use the key twice. That's really cool, right? And then you go down here, and you're like, oh, there's a good old-fashioned rewindable key, and okay, so should I do the same thing? And okay, let's do that. Again, the greedy strategy. And that seems fine, and okay, well, there must be another key down here, and we go down there, and okay, great, this is easy, no problem, I know exactly what to do. And then you go back over here, and you're like, great, I need to rewind to do that again, and wait, oh, darn, that key isn't rewindable, I didn't get it back. It's not infinitely hard, this puzzle, but again, you have to turn things around a little bit in your mind. Remember how I said before, oh, like the sparkly greenish gold key, that's the super wonderful key because you can get it out of pits. But actually here we realize, oh, that's not always the more useful, more powerful key because you can't get it back. So the things that are immune are also the things that you can't get back. And that was really interesting to me, and we'll say more about that on the next level.
Yeah. One more thing to say about this one. When I first designed it, right, the idea to do, well, it's much like the level phase or a few other levels where we have a simpler version of a problem that's not supposed to be that hard.
Right.
It's supposed to be cool and introduce you to the idea and just show this new phenomenon, right?
Right.
So we have the easier version and then the harder version. It's got one extra gate, one extra key. Maybe you don't even notice the extra key at first, right? Because it's way off down in the pit. And I arrived at this, I think, a little bit by trial and error. I was like, what can I do that's like harder and stuff? And then after I made it, I realized the harder puzzle is reducible to the simpler puzzle after one move, but almost
right
nobody
first
ever
move.
premeditates. Yes.
Yeah.
And the right first move okay. There's misdirection here in the sense that we give you the wrong key first, and obviously, and in fact, when I give you the wrong key, you haven't even seen the other key. But usually people are just going to start making progress on the puzzle. So they open the first gate that they can use with the key that they can see, and then they start looking around, like what's down the ladder. Right. Oh, there's another key. Great, right? And so it's set up to encourage people to do it wrong. And I mean, maybe through some freak chance, some very small number of people do this right the first time, but I doubt it, right? It's one of these things in the game where we really encourage you to get here and get stuck, right? And then look at the thing and say, wait, there's more gates than keys.
Yeah. I was stuck here for a long time. I was like making up theorems and proofs. Like I can prove that this puzzle is impossible because this key can only get through that gate. And then, but if I try to get the key back, I close that gate again, blah, blah, blah. And, in the end, the solution is it's not like a ton of moves or something, but it is a deliberately non-intuitive order. Of course, in principle, you could make if you have a rewindable key, you could go through as many sparkly gates as you wanted. And you could probably make diabolical combinatorial puzzles with like sets of keys and sequences of gates and God only knows what, and it's probably NP complete and so on. But, this was a very nice taste of you sometimes have to follow a different branch than the one that made the most sense at first.
Yeah. And I do think like this is very clearly something that this game doesn't do, what you just mentioned about making ever more complex, piled up puzzles.
Right. They don't get bigger, which is, I think that's good because some puzzle games, they just get bigger.
Well, I think, what the game is after is to communicate the ideas, right? And after this second one, that was all the cool idea that I had at the time as the designer of this. And after that's done being communicated, like giving you more puzzles is not necessarily like that's filler, right? But it's not really good, right? And so while making this game, I started to learn this aesthetic that it's not exactly a minimalist aesthetic. I think that's the wrong word, but it's right sizing things, right? It's like what's interesting, focus on that.
And then avoid the bunnies.
And this is a cannon that has absolutely no purpose, really.
Yeah. And I know. It's okay.
It's one of those things, we didn't remove it from the revised version of the game because it's there and we don't want to wreck the game and make it something that it wasn't. But it really was here to just add a little bit more tension to the level or something.
A frisson of danger.
And both that and the bunny there and the guy at the bottom here that like even I still always die to this day, they could all go and it would be fine,
But it's okay. I mean, so there are games where every single object, every single feature of the architecture is a puzzle element. And, I think at this point, the player understands that that's true of almost everything, but I think it's okay. It's not true of everything. It's okay to have some decoration, decorations that kill you.
Yeah. Decorations kill you the best kind, man.
Here we learn this cool new dynamic of a thing that can imbue you with immunity, because if monsters and clouds and platforms can be immune, why not us?
One extra thing that I do here In part, it just is to make the level simpler and neater, but in part, it's to seed the idea of rewinding, right? Because there are deliberately 2 times here when you can't get back. So one is you drop down to the left to throw the switch, you throw the switch, and then you're like, oh, I try to jump back up, but you have to rewind to get back, right?
And luckily, it's a sparkly switch.
Sparkly switch, sparkly other platform, so they don't go backwards. And you see the monsters go back, which is like a taste of what the level is setting up, right? So then again, later, you're like, what does that platform do? You know, you ride platforms in the game, but this one, well, it's got this little white sparkles or foam or something. You haven't seen that, right? So you have no idea what it does. But then maybe at this point, people start to figure it out, right?
Right. I think I didn't recognize that this was a new type of thing with a new type of sparkle until I stood on it and had that nice effect of the particles glomming onto me, and now me also flashing gold and green.
This was one of those, you know, so sometimes I design top down in that, like, I have the idea and how do I make the idea happen, right? And sometimes I design bottom up, which is like, let me just explore the world of the level and see what happens and see what's interesting about that, and then figure out how to compose those things into bigger experiences. And this was very definitely a top-down idea, not a bottom-up one. It was like, what are the high concept things I could do with rewind? Maybe you have to rewind a really long time and maybe really fast. I don't know if the fast thing came initially, or I think I added the rewind speed multiplier specifically for this puzzle because I was like, it'll be cool to see things, because you've seen like time-lapse films or whatever where things, you just expose it.
And you hear the music play fast and backwards, which sounds really fun. And
yeah. And so this was a moment that I wanted to create in the game. And how do I make an actual puzzle out of it, right? And so you have to sort of make a little bit of an out-of-the-box connection that, like, oh yeah, I can still barely see this puzzle piece on the left-hand side, which is deliberate again, right? It's like, it's not right above you. Once you come off this platform, now we have a little bit of a gauntlet that you have to run again.
I think
so this one is a little bit different in a couple ways. One is if you mess up, you can rewind and you don't take a penalty because that door is also rewindable, right?
Right.
So it's really just about getting there. It's not quite like irreversible, which was irreversible, right?
Right.
We don't want to do the same thing twice here, but it's interesting to give you something to do. And I kind of, in a video game way that doesn't have that much to do with time or anything, I just like that you kind of have to dodge the same bullets twice because they come up through the spikes and they go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just died a zillion times on my way back out, and I didn't care.
That works too. That's, you know, we don't keep a death count in this game, but if we did, for a lot of people, it would be very high. By the way, here's one of the places where I mentioned that it's possible to see cannonballs hit each other. Here, they're tuned so that they hit each other like every 7 or 8. I forget.
Right, because the frequency is a little bit different. It's like a beat frequency.
Yeah.
Right, when we have these two frequencies that are slightly different.
But so you're basically guaranteed to see that in the course of solving this level. Now, whether you pay attention to it, who knows? Because there's a lot of stuff happening. There's
so
like
you're saying some
people
might see that, and even without having solved the previous puzzle.
Yeah, it's a way, it's like if you haven't ever thought of the idea that two of these things colliding might destroy them or interfere with them, because maybe they just pass through each other. Who knows? It's a video game, right? And so this is a demonstration of what happens, and maybe that helps things click. And even if it doesn't help it consciously click, like even if you don't go, oh, let me go use that in the other place, you know, it maybe percolates a little bit over time.
I see.
Yeah.
So if people gave up on that prior puzzle and walked right through, then this would suggest something that they could go back.
Yeah, because they might, you know, if you don't have the idea of stopping the bullets, it just looks unsolvable. Again, you're like, the only thing you might think is maybe there's a bunch of rabbits here and maybe I'm supposed to bounce off a bunch of them and get up, but you can't actually do that, right? I hope not.
The pit. Oh yeah, so here's another thing where he has to go in the cubby. But then we're like, oh my gosh, space equals time now, and I need to get to where he is, and if I just jump down, I'm in the wrong place. And anyway, all right. So, and we also have this strong sound cue with the sound grinding back and forth, which drove my wife crazy, and I had to put on my headphones.
Probably the best moment in this level is when you first enter the level and you get to experience the way, because it's very different from the rest of the game that you've played so far. Right?
But there's also something that one may or may not notice on this level, which is if you bonk a monster while moving left, gee, he doesn't die. But that's because you're moving left and driving time backwards. He only dies if you bonk him and then move to the right. And that's kind of interesting. When we were talking before about the platform, that it's like it's there in the present or in the past, but I can still interact with it now and what's going on. Here, there's a similar thing like, gee, is moving to the left the same as rewind? And it isn't, because you can still rewind your own world line, which might include both left and right motions. So that's a little interesting. And now there's kind of two notions of what it means to go backwards in time.
And that was interesting to try and design and program, because I had that same question. I was like, wait, yeah, they are different, and that's interesting. Should I make them the same, though? And I didn't quite see how to do it and have it be good, because like either when you push left, it's the same as the rewind button, right? And then
But
you're
then
not
how do you
actually going
rewind?
left. Yeah. And what's the point of that, right? Or it's a different thing, right? Yeah.
Right.
And so, yeah. So now there's sort of this idea that like rewinding the whole time has been rewinding your personal time in a way, except you never had a difference between that and anything else before this.
Right. So now you can rewind your personal time and through your motion control which way time flows in the rest of the world.
Yes, it's a very egotistical world where everything responds to you.
This is Jumpman and, of course, Homage. And we get over here, and, of course, we're doing the thing that we were trained to do when we played Donkey Kong before most of our listeners were born. And then you get here, and you're like, wait, hold on, he's at the top of the ladder. What am I going to do? So the first few things I tried here was, well, I could rewind, but, oh, no, it's still the same situation. I'm just undoing and redoing the same situation. And, you know, again, it's this kind of nice joke or misdirection that, well, that's not how you're going to get up onto that platform, even though you played Donkey Kong as a child. And look, you can ride that guy up.
I mean, how long did it take you to think of that?
Not sure. I mean,
maybe
I think
not that long.
Not too long. I mean, again, it's sort of like most things are there for a reason. He's there. We can make him go backwards. Backwards is up. We can jump on top of him. There's that platform there. But still, it was very satisfying.
There's a certain kind of puzzle mindset, which is, I have faith that everything in this puzzle is not random. That guy's over there. What's he for? Right. Because the game could disappoint you by adding lots of random guys, and then you stop thinking that, right?
But there's also some faith that I think the designer of this game enjoys things that are deliberately not quite what I expected first.
Yes. And so, you know, what you mentioned about the climbing up the ladders, that was very deliberate. And it's a little bit of a joke, again, not a super funny joke, but it's like mildly like, I see what you did there, right? But also it is a little bit of, it's a little bit of misdirection, because until you get about here, once you get about 2 person widths from this ladder, you see the problem, right? Prior to that, you don't necessarily. But in addition to being that kind of like, let's lead you down a path and then prevent you from that, it is also establishing a pattern to make the way that you get up more interesting, right? So like you could erase all this Donkey Kong stuff and just have the level be, there's this guy on the left and you have to like climb up a ladder, and most of this geometry would be gone. And if this were like a minimalist puzzle game, that would be the level, maybe, right? And then it would be just kind of a tweaky, weird action thing.
Right.
But in the context of this other, and I'm going to use the word like fiction here, or story of what you're trying to do, which I don't usually like using that language, but there is this, you have this personal narrative of like, I'm trying to go up the Donkey Kongs, right? And it's working great. I'm just doing some light platforming of dodging the guys. And then you get here and then you have a problem. And then the guy on the side is like, you get to, it amplifies how interesting the thing is that you're doing, right? As opposed to just oh, I used the guy to get up on a ledge I wouldn't normally be able to get up on. That's kind of boring.
Well, and of course, this is a very humorous level, so we're getting a sense of the author's sense of humor here. It's a cuter version of Misdirection than what we're talking about with the 2 keys and the 3 gates. But there's another nice thing which is going on here, because just a moment ago in the previous level, we were like, oh, wow, now you have all this control. You can reverse your own world line, your own personal time, and you can control the direction of the world. My gosh, what can't you do, right? You could control everything. But you realize here that this mechanic where space equals time also creates new constraints. It's not just more control than before. And one of those constraints is if he's at the top of the ladder and you're at the bottom of the ladder, and there's kind of axiomatically, you have to look for a different path. And recognizing that is, of course, very important in the very next puzzle. Oh, and there's this really cute thing of, oh, gee, there are 2 ways I could get to that puzzle piece. I could approach it from the left or from the right.
Yeah,
and then you try to approach from the right, and you're like, what happened? My key, it just broke. Why isn't the door open? And then you realize, oh, it's not open because I just attempted to open this gate while moving backwards in time, and the mechanics of gates doesn't like that. And so then you have to go back and do some of it. You have to get back up there again. And
well, you have to leave the level because the key's destroyed and you can't rewind it. It'll never come back.
Which is slightly, I admit that's slightly frustrating that you have to go back to the clouds and do some stuff over again. But, it's a lesson well learned.
Well, so it is a little bit mean. This is like a mean moment in the game because in the same way that earlier in the game, like with the gate example you mentioned, it's set up so that we're really encouraging you to do it wrong. Here, we're also really encouraging you to do it wrong, right? And
right, it's true that one also, if you use like the wrong key, you're kind of screwed and you have to restart the level. I did find that a little frustrating, I admit.
Well, yeah, but it's intentionally.
Sometimes you have to bring the pain.
Yeah, it's intentionally a little bit like here it's so much apparently more straightforward. The key is right there. Yeah. The gate is right there.
Exactly.
Now, you should have been wary from the fact that there's 2 gates to the same thing so simply. And honestly, you should have known that walking left doesn't do certain things by now, right? Because that's what you've been doing for 10, 15, 20 minutes at this point. But most people do it anyway. They just sleepwalk into it. And the way that I thought about it was, it's a little bit like a smack to wake you up if you're sleepwalking through the game. Mm-hmm, and what you do matters actually. Yeah. It's a mild negative experience in the middle of a bigger game that's hopefully a positive experience.
It's also the fact that the key is sparkly and immune to rewind means 2 things. One, as we'll encounter a couple levels later, is it means you can carry it to the left. And the other is that you can't get it back after you broke it.
Yeah, and there's no way to get in the rules of the game. Like what you would like is to be able to carry it to the left and then get it back after you mess up. And that's just simply not possible according to the rules of this universe. So it's not my fault that it's mean, you see. It's like, that's just, the universe is a little bit mean. I just put the gate there. That's all.
So now, right away, we're faced with exactly the same situation. He's at the top of the ladder whenever we want to get up there. What are we going to do? Oh, it's got to be something involving those gates. But even once we move the gates, it's still a little confusing because now we can't get around him.
I would say this is one of the harder puzzles in the game. It's also one of the earlier ones that I designed. It got modified a few times. I would say it's a little bit still rough to play. It's hard to play. Because it's hard to think of a solution, and then it's a little hard to execute the solution.
It is a little hard to execute it because you have to jump off the guy's head.
You have to jump off,
and then move to the right in the right way. And
you have to go left to get past the switch, right? That's what you do to reset it, and then you have to go right, And it's just,
Right.
it's hard to do both of those things.
And it took me a while, even though there's an audible cue, it took me a while to realize that the switch was being reset as I was moving through the air above it, because my X coordinate moved to its left.
Yeah, although you can pre-think that out if you're thinking clearly about the puzzle. But it's hard to execute the left jump and then come back
turn
and
around,
air control and turn around. It's very hard.
I think also for me, there was a psychological thing that held me back on this level. Somehow I understood that moving left or right ran time forward and backwards, but I always thought of that as standing on a platform and walking or running to the left or right.
Yeah.
And even though it's the same mechanic, I think I had a little bit of trouble conceiving that same mechanic was running even when I was in midair.
Because it's in the air, yeah.
Which, of course, then you learn it, and that's cool.
But maybe this is too steep of a learning curve, depending on your target audience. If you're trying to make a puzzle game for the biggest audience possible, that's probably true, right, for that aesthetic. And so you would probably have like a starter puzzle where you have to flip the switch back by running on a platform, like you said. And then this would be a smaller increment from that. It would be like, wait, I can't, if I run on the platform, I'm below it, and that's not where I want to be, right? And so you can imagine a bigger level that has that sequence. Now, one of the constraints I painted myself into on Braid, which is good in some ways because it kept the game focused, is that there's 12 puzzle pieces per world, right? And so if I started getting lots of ideas for things to do, I kind of had to pick and choose. And so I wasn't really in the mode of extending things, or like ramping things in like that.
Right.
Although in The Witness, I do that a lot, right? And so maybe that's an aesthetic that I learned more how to do in The Witness and didn't have as much in mind here. Although I do it a lot, actually, like phase and the locked gates and stuff in Irreversible.
But
so,
you don't do really long sequences here.
Yeah.
And I think it's nice in the end that the total number of puzzles is not that large, but each one has a nice element to it.
Yeah. But, if I were redesigning the game, which we're deliberately not doing, but if I were, I'd be pretty tempted to change it, like we were just saying, to have more of a lead in. Because again, what's interesting is difficulty isn't that interesting. Like if things are too easy, they're boring, right? But if they're too hard, it's like, So something should be not more difficult than the point behind it is interesting, right? You need to see enough interest to validate the effort and the pain and whatever. Right. And hopefully that's true through most of this game for most people. But, sometimes it's not.
It needs to feel worth it. And of course, people have different thresholds on that.
If I were redesigning the game, which we're deliberately not doing, but if I were, I'd be pretty tempted to change it, like we were just saying, to have more of a lead in. Like if you imagine the level was a little bit longer, extending it to the left, you could use him like you use in the hunt level to like bounce down and back up onto like a little nub on the left that you couldn't, like if you can directly jump to it, it's stupid, right?
Right.
But
that's true. Just a place to rest and plan your next move.
Maybe it's not stupid if you could directly jump to it. Like maybe that's fine. But then people would do it when they would like automatically solve the puzzle.
Well, but I think if it was far enough so that you had to bonk him in order to get there, then you're still doing the double jump. It's just you're doing it in two pieces and you can rest and think in between.
Yeah, but that does eliminate. So one of the reasons this is in the level is to zoom in on that aspect that you've already encountered, as you mentioned with the monsters, that, they don't die when you bounce off into the left.
Right.
And they do when you bounce off to the right. Well, why don't we make you do that in very short sequence on the same monster, right? And it's like, but it's a tweaky thing to do, and so I kind of wonder.
Well, it's also
if there's better ways to pull it off.
It's a callback to one of the very earliest puzzles, where in order to reach a key, you have to do a double bonk.
Yeah,
but that required two trolls, and now you can do a double bonk on one troll if the first bonk is heading to the left. And that's kind of cool.
I could imagine a revised puzzle. I wouldn't try to fit it into this one, but if I wanted to take that idea that we were just talking about, it would be like there's somewhere you have to get into the air on the left and then also somewhere in the air on the right. Like maybe the
And you're like, how am I going to do that with only one monster?
Yeah. There could be like a sparkling key in the upper left and then a gate on the right, and you use the monster. That would be a simpler way to try to get. So maybe I would factor that puzzle out of
If you're
this
going,
puzzle.
if the key is to the left, it doesn't need to be sparkly because you're going to carry it to the right.
Yeah, but if there's a little bit of slop or something, no, it's probably fine.
Like I said, I'm not a strong platformer. It was okay with me that there were some puzzles that took some execution.
Yeah.
And we're getting to use here the fact that bonking him while moving to the left doesn't kill him, which means we can do it again, which is something that we have to do, I think, in a couple more places. So we have to do this left and right jumping a bit here as well, right? Because we need him to survive.
Well, you can sort of go up here, I guess, but like you can do it this way and avoid the jump.
Oh,
which is weird because
didn't figure that out.
Well, you could also doing a left jump is tricky because you have to go far enough left to get him alive again, and then air control to the right.
Exactly. So the way I solved this was I jumped on him, I bonked him going to the right, I resurrected him by going to the left midair, and then I had to go to the right in order to get on the platform, and it was pretty delicate. So, but right, I mean, that ladder is right there, that planter or whatever it is at the top is right there. So maybe this is a good example of a place in the game where there is a twitchy solution and a more relaxed and insightful solution.
Again, it was a long time ago, but I think I was trying to tune this to make that solution impossible, and that it's still...
I got it after 17 or 18 tries.
Yeah.
It wasn't that many, but
you
yeah.
know, so you'll note that I made it less obvious because the platform is really high up, so that you can't see the monster necessarily, right?
True.
Until you jump way down there, right? And that makes it so you have to be a little deliberate,
right?
And that was one of the things. So again, when I made the level, I was sort of thinking, how many times can we like have the player loop through that empty space in different ways to do what they want to do? And it's sort of like 3, right? Or 5, I don't know, depending on what you count. Because you've got to stomp on the monster, you've got to get him alive again. Then you've probably got to knock the key down there, and then you've got to go down and back up and get the key in and up, right? So like it's kind of cool to do these figure eights.
That planter makes me think of Edward Gorey somehow.
Which one?
That, the urn or vase or whatever it is at the top of that platform.
Oh, yeah. It's sort of one of the column tops that we use.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess it could be a vase. This is, back in the day, we had to ration our efforts. And so we reused graphical assets where it made sense. And so what this really was is it's like a nub that marks the end of the platform. It's a little bit suspicious because obviously there could be a flat platform here.
Right.
But it's like, go to the right and you want to go to the right and go through the gate, right?
Yeah.
And so jumping over this to the left is not necessarily something that people are going to think of. And then even if they do this, if you fall to the left, you get back where you started and it's not necessarily better, right?
I see, yeah.
So you have to really jump to the left.
And then go all the way across.
And then go across.
Okay. Hunt in this world. This is one of my favorite puzzles in the game. Because again, you think you know what to do. You've seen this a couple times, whatever. And you bonk them, but then you start noticing that, well, of course, they get unbonked when you're heading to the left, or they don't get bonked at all. And so you're like, oh, okay, I have to bonk them when I go to the right. But wait, I have to get back down there and bonk that other guy moving to the right. But now I have to get back over there, and I just unbonked that guy. And how am I ever going to do this? I think this is one of the strongest combinatorial puzzles in the game, in the sense that you really have to see, I can bonk them all, but I need to do that in order in their X coordinate from left to right. Once you work that out, and you have to go to the left, but not too far left because you don't want to unbonk that guy that you just bonked. And then there's a nice little lagniappe, I think, or, there's a nice little joke at the end where you think that this scheme is going to fail miserably.
Yeah.
Because you think, oh, well, okay, I planned this out so beautifully, but wait, that last guy is to the right of the ladder, but then lo and behold, the gate itself is sparkly and it's open now, and it's okay that he's alive at the end. And as a little extra thing, I was just feeling neighborly toward the trolls at this point, so I resurrected all of them before leaving the level.
Okay,
I just felt that was the polite.
That.
That was the polite thing to do, you know?
Yeah, they're your buddies, right?
Yeah,
they helped you get where you are today. You
exactly
should acknowledge them.
And it's true, they look a little grumpy, but who doesn't, you know? And so I just wanted to leave this level with them all alive.
I get you.
Movement by degrees. So, you know, the first part is kind of tricky, but it's sort of clear what to do. Now we're really having to deal with a mixture of rewindable and non-rewindable things, except now the non-rewindable things mean things that trundle forward in time, whether we move left or right or not. And so we have to deal with that, and it's fun. By the way, I like the art on this world too. The sort of, you know, you see all these childhood things in the background. And of course, it's very nice that the snow falls up whenever we're moving to the left.
Took some doing.
Yeah.
I'll tell you.
Why not just run the code backwards? I don't understand.
Anywho.
So then the hard part, of course, here is dealing with the 3 cacti later on. For me, it took several tries because I was like, oh, wait, okay, I see what I have to do. There's a couple places in the game where I felt like, okay, I need to build up a time bank, right? I need to sit somewhere for a while until I have enough to rewind, because you can't rewind into things that haven't happened yet.
Yeah.
And so I did that, and then I realized I needed to do the fast rewind to move to the left quickly enough, or at least that's what I thought. And it took me a couple tries. And then, of course, after doing that, I worked a lot harder to get 2 monsters onto the platform so I could get up a little bit higher to the ultra super secret places. And that was fun.
Right on.
Yeah, of course, it's also, as you say, when you're to the right down there, the 3rd cactus is like just sitting there up. And I remember feeling like, well, when does it go down? The question is where?
Yeah.
Because we're in this world.
And that's just a kind of neat, like by this point in the game, you've done that enough that that's not new, but it's still a little bit, it's a slightly different permutation of that than you've had to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this one, the general pattern here.
But it's tricky because the monster's off the camera to the right, and so I felt like I had to learn about the timing because there were things about this puzzle that I didn't find the optimal solution.
Yeah. One thing I do a lot in game design is, you know, at first you see a puzzle, you're like, what should I do? You start getting an idea what to do. And if it's the right idea, we make it pretty easy to establish the pattern that it could work or seem like the right idea. And here with these 2 guys, right, I'm standing way down here. And it's not that hard once I figure out where they're down.
But then what do you do about the 3rd one?
Right.
And there's no way to get over there fast enough.
Well, and it's just a simple puzzle trick, first of all, that like, wait, he's up the whole time over here, right? And so the smart way to do it, or the efficient way to do it, is stand up here for a while. So you have a big fat target to hit while rewinding. And then you go do the other stuff. And then you rewind fast and hit that. And then you just go up. But you actually have plenty of time, right, to hit the monster.
Movement Amplified. Is that another novel title? Or
No, I mean,
it makes sense in this level.
It was where this came from was these 2 levels. I was originally thinking of them as being kind of parallel to each other, and they ended up maybe not so much.
Well, when you get on the cloud train here, including this first pair of cloud trains.
Yes.
Again, so for me at least, for the style of games that I like, this was another one of these wonderful moments where it's like, oh, so is this a new object? Like, is this a super fast conveyor belt? Because you find those sometimes in games, right?
Oh, yeah.
But no, it's the same engine following the same rules. It's just that there's a little bit of a recursion here where, well, you're standing on some moving clouds. As time changes, the clouds move, but that makes time change more. And it's also kind of confusing at first, right? That it speeds it up going in either direction. But think about it. It makes sense. If you're running the clouds backwards, they move farther to the left, which means faster backwards. And if you move to the right, they're moving faster to the right, which makes time go faster. Yes. And I hope I said that right.
There is also a technical note about this and how it was programmed and why that's the right math. Yeah.
Right. When you realize that this is following from the same physics in the same engine, again, using the word physics somewhat broadly,
sure.
For me, there's a real pleasure in that because, if every new puzzle has a new widget with new behavior, well, maybe that's not the right way to make more variety. Maybe it's nice to have the variety emerge from the rules. So I really enjoyed both these cloud trains and the next one. And of course, this was a little bit tricky, and I thought at first I had to do something else. It's a nice fact that the key rolls back toward you if you screw up.
Yeah. So here I brought back the left-right gate, right? But
is there any way to?
No.
Yeah, we can't ever use
it's
the
just,
right gate.
It's more like a callback to the earlier part of the game, right? In case you'd forgotten about it, about your poor performance in that episode, we bring it back.
And so then we have another one of these things, again, amplified by time. We have this nice moment. We have to jump on it, even though it's off camera, but it's okay. We know it's going to be there in time to catch us, and there it is. And we can just barely make it onto the next platform.
Which, I mean, really, that's the kind of leap of faith in the game,
right?
Honestly, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So that's nice.
Yeah. Programming World 4 so that these clouds would work was pretty interesting. Every frame, a video game must know how long it should simulate the motion of its objects in order to make the rendered scene look smooth. For most games, the simulated time matches the real time measured by the clock on your wall. If the game is displaying at 60 frames per second, then each frame should represent 1/60th of a second of simulation time. Braid plays around with time very heavily, though, especially on this world. Through World 4, we use the player's speed at the start of the frame to determine how much time should be simulated. But as explained in another note on this level, when you're riding on a moving object, this relationship gets very complicated. It appears to have an infinite regress, where your motion causes the platform you're riding on to move, which causes you to move even more, which makes time go forward more, which makes the platform move further, and so on forever. An unsophisticated implementation might run many simulation steps instead of one, simulating ever smaller amounts of time until we decide that the residual amount is so small that we can ignore it. The problem is that running a simulation may require the computer to do a lot of computational work, which takes time. Running many simulation steps takes a lot more time than one step, and in this game, the amount of work to do in each step does not really decrease as we make the simulation time shorter. So we would be in danger of taking too long to compute all the simulation steps, resulting in a low frame rate for the game, which would feel pretty bad. Fortunately, we don't have to do a bunch of simulation steps if we know a little bit of math. The result of walking on a moving platform can be represented as the summation of a geometric series, and provided the speeds of the objects you're riding on are reasonable, the series converges. It's representable in closed form very simply. We just need to do an extra add, a multiply, and a divide. Much cheaper than running many simulation steps. We'll cover the exact math for this in the next part. In this world, time moves as you move. You move to the right, time goes forward. You move to the left, time goes backward. Usually you're running on solid ground, but what happens if you're riding on a platform that is itself moving? If you're walking to the right, time for the world goes forward because of your motion. So the platform, being part of the world, moves right. Since the platform is carrying you, it takes you even further to the right than you would have gone if you were just walking. So time should go forward even faster because your speed through the world is faster than walking speed. If you're walking to the left, time goes backward in the whole world, and the platform, being part of the world, goes left now because right was forward for the platform, left is backward. This carries you further to the left, which makes time go backward even faster than on solid ground. So interestingly, time goes faster in both directions. Riding on a moving object acts as an amplifier of the amount of time that passes both forward and backward, as long as the object is moving to the right when time is forward. If the object is moving to the left when time is forward, it works against your walking speed, so it reduces the amount of time that passes, so you go more slowly, again, both forward and backward. Since before you get to this world, the game involves riding on lots of moving objects, the game would be incomplete if it didn't explore the interaction of platforms with the world for time behavior, and the player would miss out on some weird moments. In this level, I wanted the player to interact with a surface moving forward and a surface moving backward. I wanted them close to each other so you could see both moving at once. Usually in this game, the platforms you ride on are short, but the speed up or slow down effect would only happen momentarily on a short surface because you would walk off the surface pretty quickly, and that would be disorienting due to the rapidly changing speeds, and it would be harder for the player to understand what's happening, and harder for us to make puzzles with. So I needed a way to make long platforms. Here I did that with cannons shooting clouds at a very fast rate, though on the right side of the level we have a comically large cloud that floats by for no apparent reason. There are also some technical issues involved in making this all happen, doing the programming and working out the math, that are pretty interesting.
And this is the other one that was really frustrating at first, and at first just felt like some cruel new tweak of the engine, and then one realizes that the punishment is just and fair, and that it's the same engine that's always been there. You just have not encountered before a good old-fashioned rewindable key, which you are trying to carry to the left. And you can't, because when you move to the left, it's going back in its timeline. And in fact, it took me a little while to realize that even when I'm walking on a platform, it's like, gee, why is it kind of bobbing along with me? Oh, I'm not carrying it. It just happens to be moving backwards in time, in sync with my moving to the left. The title of this one, Fickle Companion, it's like, how do I get this thing to stay with me? It's always jumping away from me. It just takes a while to realize. In fact, I may even have solved this the first time without quite realizing the logic of it, just kind of trial and error.
Sure.
But then on my second and third playthroughs, I'm like, oh, this is behaving exactly as it is supposed to behave. And, then we have to play with the platform, keep the monster alive.
Put the key in the right place.
Yeah, and that took me a couple of tries. It's like he would get the key, but then I was behind him, and then I was following him, and then I didn't get the key in time. There's a nice little chime when you kind of reacquire the key and restart its writing. And then there's this ending part also is very nice, where you have to get the key from him. You can move left through there. Then you have to get the key from him again to get through that second gate. And then I sat there for a while saying, but how do I get back out?
Yeah.
And then I realized, oh, I can just rewind out because it's a sparkly puzzle piece.
You could come up with ways to make it a longer puzzle, but
right.
I felt like at that point the job was done, right?
Yeah, and here you can just sort of pull the ripcord and rewind out. And then I loved the fact that the space equals time mechanic is still applying to the stuffed dinosaur's speech. And, that was really fun. So we notice that the key, like the bunny, has the purple glow. So we know that it's something that both we and our shadow can interact with. And, that gap is wide, but not so wide that I didn't try a couple of times to get the timing just right to jump across it, and it's just a little bit too far. And then, of course, the solution is our own shadow leaps across and hands it to us as we reach out our hand just far enough to catch it, and he dies in the spikes, but he sacrificed himself for us.
There's two things I can say at least about designing this. One of them is the tolerances required to make this work are actually kind of tight. Again, anytime you jump, right, you have a choice of how close to the edge of the platform do you jump.
Right.
It has to be completely impossible to jump across the gap from the right, otherwise the puzzle is ruined. At the same time, as we want this gap to be wide, we also need it to be narrow, because when you're standing back on the other side, it needs to be plausible that you're grabbing the key. Like you need to intersect with the key as it arcs over. And that's actually pretty hard.
You know those movies where there's a parallel you in some other universe, and, then there's this awesome scene where finally you and they meet and, reach through, I don't know, a mirror or whatever the thing is that separates us from that parallel universe. And it's poignant, and I don't know, like that to me, this was a really cinematic moment. And I felt for him. I mean, he's dying. He's dying to give us the key.
This is a little bit of a violation of, like, if I were an extreme puzzle purist when I made this game, such as I perhaps am a little bit more today, I would have thought more about whether this is a good idea for a puzzle, because this was one of those top-down puzzle designs where it's like, it would be neat if you had to use one guy to distract a monster, right? And then go sneak in, right? That was the whole idea. And I just thought about how can I make that? And it's difficult to do that because if rabbits are out in the open, you can just kill them by jumping on them, right? Or you could jump over them to get past them. Like, it's actually pretty difficult to come up with a scenario using the base game rules that would enable that puzzle. And so I added a little bit of extra code to this one guy that he just doesn't like to come out of his little cubby hole. So there's no way to jump on him.
Well, rabbits have different personalities.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And I do think there's an extent to which maybe it makes the puzzle a little bit more random, right? Because when you know the complete behavior of something, you have all the information that you need to, like, decide how to deal with it. That said, these rabbits don't show up that often in the game. And when they do, you're sort of panicking anyway, right? But here it's scary. Like, if you observe that his behavior is different, right? Like, oh, I expect him to keep chasing me and then he doesn't quite. Well, how else is the behavior different, right?
I feel bad for him, actually. He looks a little bit sick. He looks a little sad.
Maybe that's why he doesn't want to come out.
Yeah. But it's true. You have all this space on the right, and you feel like you ought to be able to lure him out there and then just bonk him. But
and that just doesn't work. And that's a little weird, but it's not really something that people complain about the game, so maybe it's fine.
All right.
Here is a simpler version of the Mimic distraction puzzle. I did think of this form of puzzle when designing the original game, but I felt it would be too easy to solve accidentally, or even when solving deliberately, it just wouldn't feel as strong. The aspect of the final design of having to enter a long passage from both sides necessitates more premeditation, and it just feels better to me. But that final design requires special programming to get the rabbit not to leave its area, because if he did go out from beneath the overhang, you could easily just jump on him and kill him. That is to say, this rabbit does not behave quite like the other ones, and the only reason for that is to implement this puzzle. Some designers would consider this a hack that acts as a mild blemish on the game. Here, to prevent the rabbit from being killed, we make the player climb up into a restricted area from which the rabbit cannot leave and cannot be attacked from above. Thus, no special programming hack is required. This initial cliff on the left is here because the rabbit chases you very slowly when you are far away. So, if you were able to wake him up and then walk to the left side of the level, you could coax him to walk all the way over to the left. Then you could successfully race to the ladder and win without using the parallel universe at all. Because that would break the puzzle, we prevent it. Today, with much more design experience, do I like this version of the puzzle better? Probably, as I'm more of a purist about these weird hacks. But there's still something enticing about the symmetry of you and your shadow entering a tunnel from opposite sides, having the rabbit chase you in opposite directions. I wonder if, by working on this further, I could come up with an even better version of this puzzle that retains that symmetry.
So let's see. The next one is crossing the gap. And this one has two elements I really like. So, first there's this cool thing of, well, the cannon doesn't produce a troll unless I bonk that troll, but I want to be up here when the cannon produces a troll. So, okay, I will send my shadow self down there to bonk the troll. No problem. That's kind of fun. A little bit of platform control, but not hard. And then there's this wonderful fact that, since the troll has the purple aura, it can interact with both real things and the shadow things. And then by controlling the timing of the platform and its shadow, because again, everything has a shadow. It's not just that we have a shadow in this world. Then we can actually do this cool 3-way switch and send the troll in several different directions. And, we can briefly create a platform that goes all the way across, which is half real and half shadow, which is pretty nice.
Yeah. For me, that was the neatest part of the level. Hey, can we make the monster walk on nothing for a little bit, right?
Exactly.
Like, isn't that kind of cool?
And we saw a foreshadowing of that earlier, way back in, like, I think the very first world, where we're briefly on nothing because we rewound.
Yeah.
And we're standing on something that was there before. And so now, it's a different version of nothing and something which is there not before, but in a parallel world. And it's a nice manipulation.
Now, there's an aesthetic game design choice there that can be made one of two ways. So if you have a monster like this that's in both realities and you want it to be supported, right? Is it that it's supported when it's supported in either reality, or is it supported when it's supported in both realities?
It could be an and or an or.
Exactly. And I chose this version because I wanted to do this.
Right.
And it seemed cool. It seemed better to do that because the alternative is, oh, he's kind of falling through stuff. Maybe it would have been good. I don't know. I just never figured it out.
Well, for the sequel, you could have many different colors of sparklies and tiny icons indicating a complex Boolean circuit hovering over each troll. Okay, just kidding. I think for a lot of people, this is their single favorite puzzle in the game. I was playing with this with
some people complain about it because it's hard.
Well,
it's probably the hardest puzzle in the game, right? There is a platform. It's really high. It's like twice jump height or something.
Right.
And it's really far. It's so far from anything else that you clearly can't jump across either. You have this question, like, what even am I expected to do here, right? And in the initial configuration of the level, the monster doesn't even come over here yet. So there's like nothing if you just walk over here from level load.
So yeah, there's the platform puzzle farther to the left with the shadow platform to get him over here.
Yeah.
But honestly, it didn't take me that long to figure this one out because it's presented to you in such a stark way. Now, you've seen other places in the game where you have to do some kind of double jump to get to higher places. Sometimes that means jumping off two monsters. We saw that sometimes with a little air control and execution, we can jump off one monster twice. Oh, but there's our double.
It's just interesting to see as a designer how, some people find certain things hard and other things easy. There's not really a uniform, this is easy, this is hard. But this puzzle is, broadly speaking, one of the harder ones.
There's two interesting things about this, I think. One is that in a lot of other places in the game, when there's tricky timing, like way back in Leap of Faith, you're like, oh, but I can rewind and adjust the timing. Well, but now rewind is a resource that you're using because you have to set up the shadow. But I think the other nice thing about this is once you have that idea, you think, oh my God, that's so acrobatic. How am I going to get that right? And it takes a couple tries, but it's actually not that hard to get right. The execution is not that hard, but then you're so proud of yourself as a player when you pull it off. So then there's this fun lair puzzle. So, again, kind of like there's a hunt in a bunch of worlds, there's a lair in a bunch of worlds, and it's kind of the same and it's kind of different. Now we have to use this mechanic of sending our shadow to knock down the chandelier, or at least that helps a lot, because this guy is not rewind immune. On the other hand, because he lives in both universes, both I and my shadow can bonk him. There's a lot of sending the shadow to bring down the chandelier, and lo and behold, we get another hit off the guy. I tried to lure the boss over to the side so that he would be under the shadow chandelier. I never quite got that right. And then I also tried to get both chandeliers to fall on him. Anyway, I didn't end up achieving any double taps. I just sent my shadow in 5 times, and
that works.
Every once in a while, I undid a tap by going back because I got fireballed and whatever. And then the other nice thing about this puzzle is we see this really stretched journey that we have to send our shadow on. I take it that the journey we have to send him on is kind of at the outer limits of how long the branch can be.
Yeah, that was the idea here, is put the lever very far to the left and the door very far to the right. And you can't really do it from the right end of the level because he
Right.
doesn't last that long, I believe. You kind of need to start here,
Right.
maybe somewhere in the middle, go up, do the thing, right? Pull the lever.
You each have a job to do, and you both have to start from that place somewhere in the middle. And I think that took me a try or two, but it was, it was pleasing because this is kind of the first point where we need to ride up against that limit on his life expectancy or branching time or whatever it is.
Yeah, design-wise, this is, again, one of those things where there's puzzle tolerances in mind, like how slowly does the door go up? How long does it stay open and shut?
Sure.
And the tolerances are actually, as a designer, they're very easy here because there's no constraint really pushing it the other way, which is nice. Unlike the other ones I've been talking about. On this one, it's just like, well, there's nothing requiring me to make it either long or short. I just have complete freedom about picking it. You can be pretty relaxed about where in the middle you decide to do this from.
Right. It's interesting. So in some of these puzzles,
yes,
the design had a very narrow window.
Yes.
In a couple of them, the execution for the player is twitchy.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like twitchy runtime and twitchy compile time or something?
I don't know.
Twitchy coding
I
time?
certainly didn't think about that at the time.
Yeah. I like the fact that a couple of the worlds end with a very nice minimal puzzle that lets you take what you've learned and it gives you, again, it's like a little paradox, a little koan. This one takes a little bit because it's like, well, we have one key in the world, but the key has a shadow, so one of us needs to open one gate, the other needs to open the other gate. How does that happen? Because if we try to, quote, program the guy and just head into the gate, well, it just uses up the key and then it's broken and it's not rewindable. My solution to this, actually, which I was quite proud of, is significantly more elaborate than the simplest solution. I bonked the guy, didn't take the key, then I went up and stood by the gate without the key.
Yeah.
But before bonking him, I did a motion such that my shadow self then picked up the key and took the shadow key to the gate. I then went back, picked up the real key, and opened the other gate. Aren't you proud of me?
I guess.
This is like way more complicated.
I'm still not
the
sure
simplest
how
solution.
you do the motion. Yeah. The solution I had in mind when I did this
was
just to come up with something a little bit simpler, right? So the problem is, of course,
which also uses the mechanic in a nice way. So.
If you use the key in your universe ever, right, it's gone. The point being, though, you can generate an infinite number of shadow guys with shadow keys, so it doesn't matter if his goes away, right?
Right.
And so the simplest way to do it is just aim yourself and just rewind before you hit the gate. And this platform is placed so that you can do a nice ballistic motion.
And again, because he does what you do, as opposed to going where you went, his ballistic motion continues even though you never went there.
Now, this is the minimalist version of the level, because if I wanted to do the shock version of the level, I could have put like 9 gates in a row, and you would have been like, oh, this is completely absurd. And it would have been a little tweakier, but maybe I could have figured out a way to make it like nice. But you can jump actually standing right before the gate, and as long as you rewind, the guy will hit it. And that's sort of the speed run way to do it, right?
So then in, let's see, window of opportunity, this has a couple nice elements. There's this coordination in the first part about one of us, me and my shadow, needs to open this gate. Another one of us needs to open that gate so I can get back out. And then, one of us needs to be over there to drop through. There's a little bit of timing. It's not too bad, but a little bit of timing involved in, this purple glowy gate needs to not be unlocked yet when I'm jumping on it, but then it needs to be unlocked by the time I'm trying to get back out. And, a little bit of execution, but not bad. In the second puzzle of this level, at first you're like, okay, more purple glowy levers. One of us needs to get up there and pull that lever. Okay, but then we learn something really profound here. which is that when we rewind and create this shadow, he's not going where we were, he's doing what we did. So that means we've now seen 3 versions of what it means to go back into the past. One is rewind, one is moving to the left in the space equals time world, and now there's getting him to do the things we programmed him to do in the past, but interacting with the world as it is now.
Well, from the design standpoint, it's actually much simpler to implement, like just putting the guy in history where you were, right? It's basically just doing rewind on a shadow universe. But I wanted it to be different. I wanted it to be reenacting what you did, but with possible differences in the world state, because that's just more interesting. And it's more, in my mind, fictionally, what this is in the game is like, there's a different reality. It's, it forks at some point. It has you in it. And it's a little weird, but, this game's a little weird.
In terms of the metaphors and the surrounding story, it's like, well, we all wish that we could have done things differently. We feel that there are these endlessly branching realities. And wouldn't it be great if we could cross that parallel world or cooperate across that branching sometimes? I think the other thing I like about this puzzle is that he's these 2 levers and these 2 platforms. It's not clear like who should do what. Mm-hmm. And so I think I tried a couple of times solutions where it was my normal self riding up the large platform in order to reach the lower lever. And you try that a couple times and there doesn't seem to be a way to do it. And, can I send him onto the little platform on the pillow? How do I get him over? Could he get the puzzle piece for me? So it's one of these nice, I think, puzzle design elements where there are several things that look like hopeful strategies.
Yeah.
And one of them doesn't work, but the one that does work forces you to learn this new thing about the mechanic.
Yeah, and as a designer, I actually expect people mostly to try what you were just saying first, because it seems more direct action, right, to do things that way. And in fact, you can, if you're super tweaky, you can get your shadow guy up there to the puzzle piece, but the puzzle piece isn't shared between universes. So he gets it, but you don't.
Yeah, exactly. It does not have the purple glow. Good point.
Yeah.
Maybe when he flickers out, maybe he's still going on and living his life, but you can no longer interact.
Maybe.
And now, again, these themes and variations. Now we have the clouds. Before we controlled their spacing with rewind, and now we've got the ring, and this first puzzle isn't too hard, and we can just slow down the clouds and get over there. The second puzzle, I think the reason why it took me so long to think of the solution is that you had a platform with a flower on it for purely decorative purposes in a level long ago. And so I thought of this as purely decorative. And so...
See, that's maybe a backfire, because the intent was... the way I think about these levels is they sort of come in pairs, right? They're reprises of each other. And the interesting thing about a reprise is you just get to juxtapose them in your mind and see what's different about them and all that stuff, right? And so this platform needed to be here for this puzzle to work.
Right.
And so, like, if it wasn't on the other one, then maybe it's less like the same level. Although that said, it probably in reality, it would have been fine, right? But it's interesting to hear that because I'd never had that thought that might cause people to disregard the platform, as opposed to maybe continually wondering why it's there.
Right. I guess for me, I read this as a bit of clever misdirection because I was used to the idea that was just decoration.
But you got it eventually.
I got it eventually.
Cheat off the internet.
I did not cheat off the internet. I did get it eventually. The other nice thing here is the influence of the ring is pretty long range. Visually it looks like it might not change things outside the circle, but it changes things from quite far away. And is it a 1 over r squared rule?
If I remember correctly, it is a 1 over r rule because it's 2 dimensions.
Ah, yes, because that's how gravity would work in 2 dimensions.
In 3D, we all know about these 1 over r squared laws, and that's because if you take a sphere that's equidistant from any given point, and then you enlarge it, right?
And the lines of force are getting spread out, and according to Gauss's law. Sorry, I'm
This is your wheelhouse right here.
Yeah.
When it comes to something like this, I had that idea from the beginning that like, oh, it's probably r instead of r squared. But I did try r squared, and it
And
just
fell
wasn't
off too quickly.
Yeah, it just wasn't that good. Like you want this feeling of like going into molasses and things are
Right.
slowing down. Right? And when it's r squared, it's much more like you're in the circle or you're not. With a fringe around it, but the fringe is hard to like problem solve with because you don't get it's very yeah. When we're sitting down to design a game, we get to decide everything about how it works. So, we have the high-level idea that there should be an object you could drop to slow down time. How do we decide exactly how it should behave, down to every detail? The game was inspired by strange phenomena created by the laws of physics, and more specifically, the slowdown effect was inspired by time dilation that happens at very high speeds or in very deep gravity wells, so we can start our thought process there. Since we are dropping a localized object, it is much more reminiscent of gravity wells than high speeds. The thing about gravity, or any other physical force, is that it is proportional to 1 divided by the squared distance between the two objects exchanging the force. A simplified way of thinking about this 1 over r squared function is that it's happening because a given amount of force is produced at one place, then the waves or particles emanate out from that point in an ever-expanding sphere. As these mediating particles go out, their density decreases with the surface area of that sphere, which is proportional to r squared in the 3 dimensions of our world. 1 over r squared, and other functions like it, are continuous, so they change gradually with changes in spatial position. 1 over r squared changes very quickly when you're close to the origin, but very slowly in a way that creates only subtle analog differences when you get further out. Analog things are hard to deal with in puzzle games. In general, discrete things are easier for the player to reason about, and easier for the designer to make sure the gameplay experience is clean, and not fiddly, and not weird. If the speed that you go at changes quickly near the center of the ring, and this speed is a big factor in how puzzles get solved, which it must be, the whole idea of the world is to slow stuff down by placing the ring, then the puzzles would be subject to a lot of fiddliness based on the exact position where the ring is placed. So if you place the ring right next to an object, that object might go at 0.1 speed, 1/10 of normal speed. But if you nudge the ring just slightly over, close enough that it might be hard for the player to intentionally choose distances at this scale, the object might now go at 0.2 speed, which is twice as fast, which makes it very hard to be consistent gameplay-wise. And if we don't limit the slowdown rate and just put a singularity at the middle, then slowdown would become infinite as you approach the center, which can become very awkward for gameplay. If you walk too close to the center or accidentally fell in vertically, it could take a very long time to get back out. And since you manipulate the ring by physically picking it up, and you'd need to be near it to pick it up, this set of game design choices drives us directly into the awkwardness. Anytime you're making choices, and you see they result directly in an unpleasant situation like this, it's a sign you should change those choices. So it was clear to me, pretty quickly, that we wanted to limit the maximum slowdown, and didn't want the maximum slowdown rate to be changing very quickly near the ring. What should the maximum slowdown be? We want it to be slow enough that you can see the effects in an obvious way, because that's very helpful when solving puzzles, and also makes the game feel cool. But also, we want the ability to design levels with lots of tolerance. You want to be able to make puzzles with wide margins of player error when the player is executing the right solution, and this necessitates the slowdown amount to be pretty high. Also, and this may sound shallow, but I wanted the music and sound effects to sound cool as you walk through the slowdown area. At some basic level, the game is about seeing and feeling time distortion, so this may actually be less shallow than it seems. But if the maximum slowdown is too much, solving can become routinely tedious because it just takes too long to move through the affected space. And if the music plays too slow, you can no longer really hear it anymore, both because your brain no longer tracks sounds that are that slow in the same way as normal speeds, and because the sound waves lose most of their energy as they get stretched so far. So the music stops being cool, and you don't get as much information about gameplay state from the sound effects. For all these reasons, I settled on an inner radius of the size you can see in the game with a max slowdown factor of 5 times. This inner radius is drawn clearly as a bubble when you place the ring. There's no maximum outer radius, and this is perhaps a design failing, because there's no way to use the ring to affect one object without it affecting everything on the level. This makes levels like impassable foliage much more difficult and messy than they might otherwise have been. But I didn't want to impose an outer radius because I wanted the ring to be as physics-y as possible, and that requires the effect to travel outward forever. Maybe it was a mistake, I don't know. Earlier we said that in 3D, the falloff would be 1 over r squared, and that this would probably change too quickly. When I tried it, yeah, it changed too quickly. I also tried 1 over r, which, in addition to being simple, is what would actually happen in 2D space, and I didn't like that either. Just going by game feel, I settled on a function involving 2 to the minus r. It is this. Boiling the function down to its simplest form, it's just 1 minus 0.8 times 2 to the minus x, where x is the number of radii away we are, and we clamp x at 0, which makes the slowdown constant inside the radius. Here's the code from the game that actually implements this. You can imagine how you might like to change this behavior and what the consequences would be.
And then cascade. All right. This is like a Rube Goldberg thing. There's all sorts of things going on in this level. The left half is coupled to the right half in complicated ways, so it's much more than one screen's worth of logic that we have to think about. So we've seen this idea of dividing the frequency by 2, stepping down the frequency. We did it in some earlier things by creating collisions, and now we can do that with the ring, so we can slow down that cannon. But there's also several nice places in this level where we can use the ring just to make our lives a little easier, right? To make the air control on some of the jumps a little easier. And then there's also some sequencing we have to think about here. So I had to jump on a monster to get onto the cannon that is floating above the flaming spikes. So I ended up placing the ring on that cannon and just leaving it there. And that meant that I had to think about the order in which I did things. And I just walked off without the ring. And luckily, I had a brand shiny new ring as soon as I entered the next level.
Yes, well, that is actually, that is intended that you leave it up there. And yeah, you left it up there, you know,
okay.
But it's a video game, right? So,
well, yeah, que sera, sera.
Yeah, like I would like for there to be a way to get you to get that back, but you would have to add a bunch of contrived stuff to the level about maybe somehow
right.
when
the
you
level
get in
already
there,
has so much stuff.
Yeah, maybe somehow when you get in there, you can throw a switch that like opens a trap door above the thing, so you could fall down and get it. But then you'd be thinking about that when you're trying to solve the puzzle, right?
Right.
So then maybe it could be a secret trap door that just looks like the rest of the background, but then you'd be through the rest of the game going like, I wonder if there's more secret backgrounds.
Well, and if it was that easy to get down onto the cannon, then we didn't need to do all the other stuff to get to the cannon.
It negates your heroic effort.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's some things that I also like about, well, and so the fact that you need to leave the ring on the level and leave the level is a little bit video gamey, but like we're a little bit postmodern here. I just really like the visual of the fireballs going into the slowdown zone and coming back out, and you seeing
nice.
the space dilation. Now, that said, okay, so one of the things I wanted to do with this level was make a level where the different puzzles sort of bleed into each other or influence each other, right? And are not separate. That's another instance of this thing that I do where I establish patterns where throughout most of the game the puzzles are separate, right? If two puzzles are on the same level,
they're usually on 2 separate screens. They're usually each about 1 screen big.
They're separated enough that you have a pretty good idea that they don't interact. And they're there more because they're related thematically.
Right.
And here all of a sudden that's different, and that increases the difficulty. And I think it decreases clarity, but I still wanted to do it in the game. And
so for me, that was pleasurable. I mean, I think some puzzles should be like that. You know, it's true that there's a lot of levels where it feels like a series of small puzzles, or little, like I said, little paradoxes or little koans. And this is much more like paragraph sized or, 5-paragraph essay sized. But I think it also helps here that once you have the logical idea, none of this execution is that hard. It's a little bit tricky to, like, even after you step down the frequency of the fireball cannon, the monster still has to go through several monsters. I think that there's a periodicity of roughly 4 or 5 before one of them gets through the gap in the fireballs down to the next level. It took me a couple tries to catch up with him and jump on top of him. Or I guess I could have hung out there and let him move under me.
The
but instead
execution's
I
a little
had
bit
to,
hard there, I think.
It's a little bit hard, but not so hard. I mean, again, because I'm not a super platformer, I mean, like I'm not somebody who could play like Celeste, right?
Okay.
I understand the beauty and the joy of those games, and I'm impressed by the people who can play those games. But for me, maybe I'm getting old, but that would be tough for me. The next level, Impassable Foliage. This one was one of the harder ones for me, but I think that's because there was an idea I was missing. And again, I think it's kind of good that there are puzzles with hard solutions if you don't quite get the idea, and easy solutions if you do get the idea. So in mathematics, the first proof of a result of a theorem is often kind of ugly and kludgy and has a lot of moving parts. And then we have what we call the proof from the book, which is something Paul Erdős came up with, where that's the proof that now everyone says, this is the elegant, insightful proof. And so I think that's actually a nice element for puzzle games to have. So, of course, this reminds us of the irreversible level from some time ago, where the only way to get up there and delay the vertical block from blocking the horizontal block was to get up there without using rewind. Now we have this new tool, namely the ring. Okay, kind of straightforward. We put the ring underneath the plant to slow it down, but now we have these 3 cacti. So we know what we need to do. We need to get monsters over there so we can jump up onto that platform. And we also are given rewind immune monsters, which makes our job here a little harder, because if we don't get onto that platform quickly enough, then we have to sort of start the process over. But the nice thing here is you have 2 kinds of control over the phase. So yeah, it took me a while to realize that the frequencies are the same. If the frequencies were not the same, then you would have to do something really finely tuned with the ring to like alter, slow down the frequency of this cactus so it matches the frequency of the monster cannon. Yeah. And thank you for not putting that in the puzzle.
Yeah.
But we can control individual cacti by putting the ring close to them, although, one over R, it does affect the other cacti a little bit too. But we can also use rewind to touch up the overall phase
and that
of
helps.
All 3 cacti at once. That helps. I like puzzle games where there is an analog element to them, either to the setting or the solution.
Yeah.
I like World of Goo.
Yeah. I mean, analog can become very messy if you're not careful, which is why you don't see it too often, but it can be an interesting space to explore.
So elevator action, when you're solving this puzzle, you're like, okay, now I really need to slow the cannons down because there's no way I can run upstream against these fireballs. I think I tried putting the ring on top of the first cannon there by the lever. And then I was like, oh, but what am I going to do about the second cannon? And then at some point you think about having the ring ride down on the elevator. And then there's this nice fact that you can retrieve the ring, if you're like close to it in Euclidean space, even if it's like on the other side of a platform, or I don't think you use this, but maybe even on the other side of a wall.
Well, there's a little bit more of a gap here than we normally would put, and that's to make it a little bit plausible that somehow you like can reach in and grab the ring, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, this elevator is an example of a thing that I do a lot in puzzles, which is I come up with what I want the level to be about, which is you get this idea that you need to slow down all the cannons, but the way you would do that, if you could, would be to place the ring above them, but then you need it for the next cannon, right? And so, and of course, the trick is to use the elevator that means we need an elevator in the level. And so we need to pretend like there's a reason to have an elevator, right?
Right.
Which is, hey, we're going to ride down to this place where the key lives.
Which looks like just a thing to do. Like, oh, that's where the key lives. I have to go down there. I have to fight a monster bunny, whatever.
Yeah, whatever. But, topologically, the key might as well be at the top of the elevator next to the switch, right? And it doesn't really matter. Now, we did manage to put some other special puzzles in the game that also involve the elevator, right? And so I get multiple uses out of it. But it's a fun thing to do as a level designer, to have a plausible excuse for something that then turns around and is instrumental in a clever puzzle solution, right? Now, you could imagine, for example, that I did put the key right at the top next to the switch, and then there's just like an elevator that doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
And then you know that you're supposed to use that in the puzzle, and it doesn't feel that good to figure that out, right? Because it's like, what's that stupid...
Right, it could have been something you just have to jump down and then you ride the elevator back up, but actually...
Because if you see an elevator and it's got no obvious use and you have a puzzle you're working on, you're like, I used that,
this
right?
is a puzzle step.
Whereas here you're like, I used it already. And so, yeah. And that just helps it feel good. And it's something that I wish more games did more of, because it's really wonderful to see it done well. Here's a version of elevator action that just implements the idea of the first puzzle, but without making any artful excuses for the level's setup. It's included here to show the usefulness of artful excuses. This version of the level is more minimal than the original, and I've said a few times elsewhere that when designing Braid, the simpler the levels got, the better they were. But this level is an exception. Here, simpler is worse because it gives away the answer to the puzzle, which destroys the magic. Imagine you're at the top of the level, you get the key, you realize you can't get back out through the cannonballs. What's the solution? Well, obviously it has to do with that elevator platform that has no other purpose. How could I use that? Well, this world is all about the ring. Oh, I'll just put the ring on the elevator. In the original level, the elevator has an excuse to exist. You ride it down to a side room where you get the key and fight a monster. Obviously, you needed to go down there to get the key, even though this is topologically the same as putting the key at the top. Also, the presence of a monster in a tight space can create a frantic experience that acts as a mental palate cleanser so that you're less likely to think, isn't it weird that there's an elevator just to go down to this useless room? Because the elevator had an obvious purpose, it becomes less conspicuous when you're thinking about how to get out. You don't really consider it as readily. Then when you realize the elevator is also the key to solving the puzzle, it's a positive surprise and there's magic to it. This is what I mean by an artful excuse. We gave the elevator a reason to exist that feels natural in order to make it less suspicious. When you design puzzles, opportunities for artful excuses will arise to varying degrees. If you don't notice these opportunities, that's one way your puzzles can end up mysteriously subpar in a way you don't feel you understand or have any power to improve. But once you see the opportunities, exploiting them well is another matter. It can be pretty hard to make excuses that really work and are not too ugly. And there's a fine line between an excuse and a red herring, the traditional name for a deceptive anti-hint that leads the player down the wrong path entirely. Red herrings usually indicate bad puzzles. Now, it is possible to mislead in a delightful way, but that's another discussion completely and is almost never what designers are doing when they add red herrings. Most red herrings are cheap, low-skill tactics. Anyone could add them at any time to any puzzle, and they make puzzles seem less fair and less clear, which weakens the puzzle and the game as a whole. But I hope you can see the situation here is something a bit different from a red herring, though it is related.
Here in Another Castle, this is another one of these like Zen koan levels. It all fits on one screen. It poses a pretty clear paradox to you, right? Like, gee, if only I could use the ring to slow down that horizontal platform to maybe get over there by the time the key is dropping. But I would also have to use the ring to slow down the vertical cannon so I can get up there to flip that lever. If only I could do that. Oh, I can. And it's a reminder that rewind,
It's still in the game. It's not just
still in
how
the
you
game.
resurrect yourself.
It's not just how, and it's also, I think a lot of the recent uses of rewind were to rewind sort of one thing, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And here we're setting up a fairly long sequence where the ring is in two different places and rewinding all the way back through to the previous place it was. And then there's this awesome cinematic hero move here where you get to leap through the air, catch the key in midair as it falls, and even do it in slow-mo. Yeah. And it looks so fantastic.
There is an alternate solution to the puzzle where you put the ring down around the bottom to slow down the key as it falls. It's barely achievable and not as fun, but you can do it that way.
Okay, so again, a twitchy way without as much thought and a less twitchy way with more thought.
Yeah.
It's also, of course, wonderful that, I mean, we've seen a couple of places now where the ring is on something moving, like a cloud or like the elevator. It's wonderful that it can fall through the air with the key and continue working.
Oh, yeah.
Right, because at first you might think the ring is a thing which lives on stationary objects.
Here is a simplified version of the level in Another Castle. The original is fairly complicated and difficult, involving the use of a floor that makes you rewind exempt. But because there are only a few of these in the whole game, you have only a small amount of experience with how they work, so it's more difficult to think through the solution. I had wanted this to be a fairly difficult puzzle because it's the final level before the endgame, and traditionally, difficulty goes up with time. And there are some good reasons for that, though we in the industry do tend to rely on this old habit a bit too much. Also, precisely because there aren't many of these rewind exemption platforms in the game, I had wanted to use another one here, because otherwise, if that game mechanic only happens once or twice, it feels pretty weird, like a one-off hack, rather than part of the overall system. But really, the important, interesting, and cool thing about the level, the idea that inspired me to make it in the first place, is just the mental image of the ring and the key falling slowly together for a long time. These days, I would be much more interested in making a level that focuses on that phenomenon specifically, without obscuring it by putting unrelated, difficult stuff in front. So, here's what that might have looked like. It is more focused, and also much easier. Braid is a somewhat short game. If all the puzzles were as easy as this one, maybe the game would feel less satisfying because you could blast through the whole thing without having to think very much. But you can structure a game to break ideas like this into multiple stages. First level, we show the cool thing with the key falling slowly, and you do have to think a little bit to solve that, but it's not too hard. Then, the next level is built around the idea of the key falling again, but with some augmentation that's interesting on its own. And there can be more challenge in the second level because the player's already familiar with the idea of the slowly falling key, and can use that as a pre-understood building block in the solution. I didn't do much of this in Braid, though the Reprise levels make this happen to a limited degree, but in later games I do it a lot. These days, I really like making sequences of puzzles where there's a flow of ideas from puzzle to puzzle, and that flow itself becomes observable by the player, and the sequence creates a more than the sum of its parts effect that can be quite sublime when fully appreciated. There are some interesting things to say about where the Reprise levels came from. Way back toward my start as a professional video game maker, when just hanging around developer conferences, I'd heard some designer friends speak enthusiastically about games where you can revisit old levels with new abilities and navigate those levels in a different way than you had before. For example, now that you have a grappling hook, you can transit a level more quickly and get to some new places that you couldn't when you initially played it when you were only able to jump. I don't actually remember which games were being discussed. Maybe they were Mario or Metroid games, but they were mostly games I hadn't played. But this stuck in my mind as an interesting thing to do in a game design. Later, when I was designing Braid, all these ideas bubbled up. But Braid doesn't work by your character getting new abilities over the course of the game. The abilities, such as they are tied to each world. And since the abilities are tied to worlds, it's not possible to actually go back to the same level with different abilities. So I flipped the idea around and had the same levels recur in different places, wherever I felt the mechanics of the new world made the puzzle interesting and different. So those are the reprises. But adding reprises does more than just help make some neat puzzles. It amplifies the experience of one of the core values of the gameplay, which is to observe and appreciate the varying rules of time and their consequences. When you see the same level in a new world and have to think about a familiar thing in a new way, this shines a light on the differences. And since the differences are caused by the behavior of time, this highlights the behavior of time in an extra way, beyond what happens when you just play an arbitrary level in the new world. Reprises were also good for the thematics of the game. Having the same levels show up repeatedly felt dreamlike, and similar to the structural repetition of the story screens. I enjoyed the feeling of important levels echoing forward through the game. A fundamental dilemma arose with regard to the reprises as development proceeded. Early on, with The Pit, for example, I would just copy the entire level from one world to another, and maybe tweak a monster position or something, but the level was visually recognizable as exactly the same. You could take screenshots of different versions of the level, and they were barely different, and this felt important to me for recognizability. But when we started adding all the graphics, each world attained its own visual identity, and then there was a problem. I want the reprise levels to look exactly the same as each other to help maximize the feeling of recurrence, but the visuals of each world are very different from each other. So if the reprises look the same across worlds, they break the visual continuity internal to each world. They feel like they're interrupting, maybe so much that the player won't get a solid feeling of each world being an intact, consistent thing. And that's bad, because it would weaken the picture of the game being organized as a series of parallel worlds where time has consistent rules in each world. Because we're just talking about how levels look in a way that doesn't affect rules of the game, some mechanics-focused designers might minimize the importance of this question. But it's crucial to understand there are two different things going on here. There's the degree to which the game is coherently organized, worlds arranged in parallel with specific rules operating in each world. And then there's also the degree to which the player is able to see this organization, to appreciate and delight in it. My job as a designer is to help players see and delight in these structural arrangements. Because design is by default invisible, it is a common failure mode to design something that players are not sufficiently able to see and appreciate. So I wanted to be extra careful about this. The alternative choice was to decorate each instance of a reprising level according to the visual theme of the world it's in, which de-emphasizes the repriseness a bit. This is the way I went, and it still feels like the right decision to me. Often in game design, you run into problems like this, where you're trying to do two things, and those two things are fighting each other. These are problems you have to solve, but sometimes no solution seems good, and the fact that you can't make a perfect decision becomes one of the things that makes development psychologically difficult. You're investing so much energy trying to make the game as good as possible, and the ideas were so beautiful when they were abstract in your mind. But that's because early abstractions don't have enough concrete details to generate the real conflicts that will eventually occur. This level works because the ring itself falls slowly. But you could imagine that the field emanated by the ring might not affect the ring itself, only everything around it. Then the ring would fall at a normal speed. As a designer, how do you decide which way it should work? This level shows you exactly how I make this kind of decision. There's something really interesting that I could do if the ring affects itself, have it fall slowly with the key for a long time, and there's no equivalent interesting thing in the other case, at least not that I could think of at the time or even now. This helps to sway the decision quite strongly. Because the ring acts on everything, including itself, for consistency, the sound effects played when the ring is manipulated are also affected by the time dilation. I decided to do this not just because it's internally consistent in terms of the laws of the world, but also because I wanted to further emphasize the change in time behavior with as many audio visuals as possible, and the ring's sound effect is very prominent at these times. In that first simplified version of this level, I dislike that the ring slows down not only the key, but also the platform holding the key up. because it means that the player could be thinking about solving the level just by slowing down the platform itself, delaying the initial time at which the key falls, which does actually make sense. So it's not like I can prevent that. But if the player is thinking about slowing down the platform, even if that doesn't by itself delay the key drop long enough to solve the puzzle, the key falling is de-emphasized in his mind. Here, I move the ledge where you place the ring down away from the platform so the ring starts falling quickly, then enters the slowdown zone. This is fine, but I don't really like it because the ring is not falling in parallel with the key all the way, which is the interesting and cool image that inspired me initially. We could attempt to fix this by making the platform unrewindable so it would not be slowed by the ring. But then, every time the player makes a mistake, he has to exit the level and come back, and that would be annoying, and it would also tread on the territory of the level irreversible, spoiling that level's uniqueness and defocusing the game. This is another case of design aesthetics at play. You make changes, you observe what's good about them, what's bad, and you try to come up with the best thing in the end. But for this to go well, you have to be astute and honest in observing what's bad. This is an actual skill you can improve, and then see if there's a way to refine bad things into good things. If not, you need to have the courage to dump the bad idea and to try to put something else in its place, even if you don't yet know what that might be.
I actually don't have that much to say about World 1. I love, of course, the fact that it's World 1 and that the numbering goes backwards. That's a nice hint. You can read the text in the other direction if you want, and the flowers are closing instead of opening. I love how the music plays backwards, and you have to do 3 increasingly tricky things about riding backwards monsters. It's fun to think a little bit about the logic of well, wait, what is the monster's actual past? The monsters have 2 pasts that merge into the same present and future. One of them is falling from the cannon, and the other is jumping down from the door, and your bonking them merges those 2 pasts into the future, which is pretty wild, right? When we think about the multiverse, we're always thinking about the present splitting into 2 futures. There's a rather mysterious thing in an advanced area of mathematics called a co-multiplication, where instead of taking 2 things, combining them and producing 1, you're taking 1 and splitting it into 2.
The idea behind the whole world was to do time being bidirectional in some way, right? This is one of the ideas that was left over from the original game that I decided to bring in the end. How do we do that there actually are 2 directions that time is going simultaneously and you could see it either way, right? And
to
so
really take that seriously.
Yeah.
As opposed to it's forward plus tweaks.
Yes. So the monsters are living backwards in some way and the player is playing forward. Now, because it's a video game made for you, you do have a little bit of executive privilege here in that you're able to change their past and they're not able to change your past, because what would that mean? Right. But the only other way that I thought about that this could possibly work, maybe I wasn't imaginative enough, but you could just imagine that both things are happening and they kind of just don't affect each other. But that's not very interesting, right? And so if you're going to affect the other direction of time, how does that work? And this is what I came up with for that.
We could simply be observers in a multiplayer video game played by the trolls, going in the other direction, in which there is one really horrific enemy called Tim, but no, backwards, we're like a super friend who's always resurrecting them and debunking them.
Could be.
And wow.
Could be. Let's talk about the physics thing for a little bit that motivated this, which is, there's this interesting thing about physical laws that they all appear to be valid bidirectionally, even going back to Newton's laws. Right.
At least the microscopic ones.
Yeah. And then even, when you get to, quantum mechanics and quantum field theory and all this stuff, it gets a little more complicated, but there's this thing called CPT invariance where you flip selected combinatorics of charge parity in time and you get a valid system running in reverse, right? So that was just the inspiration for this whole world, was just like, what if we take that seriously? Because a game is a running system, it's a little universe, right? And it's not nearly as sophisticated or interesting as the actual universe, but we can use that because it's simpler. We can like focus, and then there's a certain kind of magic that we can do where you do something in the game that is not really possible in the real world, but it seems almost like it would be.
Right.
And we do a little bit of that in Witness too, right? But in this game, it's like, let's take that law of physics a little bit seriously, and how do we make it actually work? How do we give you that experience that forward and backward in time are equally valid, and create two equally valid perspectives, right? Like if I were living the opposite direction in time, everything would make sense to me. If I were some kind of creature for which entropy appearing the reverse of what looks sensical to us made sense, right?
Yeah, in the morning you would unscramble an egg for breakfast, or well, you would eat the breakfast and then unscramble the egg. Or
you would uneat the breakfast.
Actually, yeah, this could get horrible if we follow it up.
Yeah.
I mean, I also love the background art here. We see these kind of steam vents or little volcanoes or whatever they are, with the smoke being drawn down into them. That's really cool.
Which, of course, when you rewind, they appear
absolutely
the normal direction. And some things you can't really tell. So like the little lightnings and stuff, it's like, oh, are those going forward or backward? And it doesn't matter.
I mean, I guess you could imagine some weird mechanics where like you have a move now which consists of unfalling from a platform. But I don't know how that would work, because, if it were really reverse time, you'd press the key after you unfell back up to the platform.
Yeah, I thought about that kind of stuff, and I couldn't come up with anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.